the wind that swept through Dusty Ridge, Wyoming, in late autumn carried the scent of dry pine and distant snow. It was a restless wind, lifting the red dust from the main street and powdering the brim of every hat. A fine grit that worked its way into the folds of a man's collar and the lines around his eyes. The town breathed to the rhythm of the blacksmith's hammer, a steady, ringing heartbeat against the low groan of wagon wheels turning in the thick mud left by a morning shower. It was a place of stark contrasts, where the warmth of a neighbor's lamp fought against the sharp chill of an early dusk, and where a quiet wit could be found in the most serious of conversations, a necessary balm against the hardship of the land. Wade Colton felt the grit on his teeth. At 33 years of age, he was the owner of the largest cattle ranch in the valley, a man shaped by discipline and loss. It had been 3 years since he buried his wife, 3 years of silence filling the spaces in his ranch house that used to hold her laughter. He was a man of few words. His thoughts turned inward, his life measured by the rising and setting of the sun and the needs of his herd. But now, a different kind of pressure was building, one that had nothing to do with cattle or coin. Harvest week was approaching, a full 7 days of celebration, of feasts and fairs and evening prayers. It was a time for families, and in Dusty Ridge, it was an unspoken rule that during harvest week, no child should stand alone. This was the source of the tightness in his chest. His daughter, Rosie, was 4 years old. She was a tiny thing with hair the color of corn silk and eyes that held the deep blue of a mountain lake. She was a creature of quiet habits and profound shyness, a child who recoiled from loud noises and sudden movements. Her world of trust was very small, containing only 3 things with certainty: the worn, smooth wood of her little chair by the hearth, the steadfast loyalty of the ranch dog, Shep, and the solid presence of her father. She clung to him, a small shadow following his long one, her tiny hand often lost in his calloused palm. New to this dusty corner of Wyoming was a woman named June Hartley. She was perhaps 26 or 27 years old, with a calm demeanor that might be mistaken for fragility if one did not look closely at the steady set of her jaw. She possessed a backbone of steel, a quiet resilience that was already being tested by the town. Mr. Grayson, the proprietor of the general store, a man whose smile never quite reached his eyes, had taken to pressuring her. He claimed her late father had left behind a sizable debt, a ledger entry that appeared only after the man was in the ground. June carried a secret, a shadow from her past in another city. She had been entangled in the investigation of a missing boy. Though she was fully exonerated by the law, the whispers of rumor had a longer life than the ink on any legal document. Wade first saw this resilience for himself at the Saturday market. He was standing near the feed stall, negotiating a price for winter oats, when he heard the raised voice of Mr. Grayson. The store owner was standing before June Hartley, his ledger held out like a weapon. He spoke of obligation and honor, his voice loud enough for half the town to hear. Wade watched June. She did not raise her voice. She did not flush with anger or shame. She simply stood, her hands clasped before her, and met his gaze without wavering. She told him, her voice clear and even, that the debt was not a true one and she would not be made to pay for a phantom. She spoke with such profound and simple dignity that Mr. Grayson was left sputtering, his face turning a blotchy red. Wade felt a flicker of admiration. In a world where bluster and force often won the day, her quiet strength was a remarkable thing to witness. He bought his oats and led his horse toward home, but the image of her steady gaze stayed with him. The problem of harvest week weighed on him more heavily than any winter storm. That evening, as he tucked Rosie into her small bed, the conflict took on a voice, a heartbreaking whisper in the near dark. Rosie looked up at him, her small face pale in the lamplight. She said she would not go to the festival. When he asked her why, her lower lip trembled. She whispered that she could not go if she did not have a mother. The words struck Wade with the force of a physical blow. He sat on the edge of her bed for a long time after she had fallen asleep, the weight of his failure pressing down on him. He had provided for her, protected her, given her all the love a father could. But he could not give her this one thing. He could not fill the empty space beside them. He looked at her small form, the way she clutched a small cloth doll, and a profound desperation took hold of him. He could not bear the thought of her standing alone, of her watching the other children with their mothers and fathers, feeling the keen sting of her own loss, in the quiet of the ranch house, with only the sound of the wind for company. A reckless and improbable idea began to form. It was a mad thought, born of a father's despair. He could not give his daughter a real mother in a week, but perhaps, just perhaps, he could find someone to play the part. He could hire a companion, a woman to stand with them for the 7 days of the festival, to give Rosie the illusion of a whole family, if only for a little while. The thought was foolish, improper, and bound to cause a scandal. But as he looked at his sleeping child, he knew he would consider any risk to spare her that pain. A few days later, his duties took him past the small house June Hartley had rented at the edge of town. It was a simple, weathered structure, but something new had been added. Along the packed dirt of the walkway, she had planted a row of marigolds. Their bright orange and yellow heads were a defiant splash of color against the drab brown of the landscape. They were sturdy, common flowers, not prone to wilting in the first frost. They spoke of tenacity, of a will to create beauty and warmth in a harsh place. To Wade, they seemed a quiet invitation, a silent testament to the kind of spirit that might just understand a father's desperate plan. They were a symbol of healing, of life taking root where it could. He sat on his horse for a long moment, the reins loose in his hands. The wind stirred the dust around him. The logic of his life, the strict discipline he had always lived by, told him to turn the horse around, to go home and accept the hard truths of his situation. But the image of Rosie's face, the memory of her whispered plea, was stronger than any logic. He looked at the marigolds, then down the road toward the center of town. His mind was made up. The risks were great, the potential for disaster enormous, but the possibility, however small, of seeing his daughter smile through the Harvest Week festival was a pull he could no longer resist. With a gentle nudge of his heels, he urged his horse forward, his course set toward an idea that would change the quiet rhythm of his life and hers. Forever. He would approach June Hartley. He would make his ridiculous, unheard-of proposition. He was a man walking into a storm, and he did not even know the full force of the winds that were about to break. He found her walking home, a small basket over her arm. A thin shawl pulled tight against the damp chill. A fine mist was falling, the kind of rain that does not announce itself with thunder but simply materializes in the air, clinging to eyelashes and turning the dust to a dark, slick mud. Wade dismounted, his boots sinking slightly into the soft ground. He held the reins of his horse, feeling the awkwardness of the moment settle on him like the dampness in the air. He was a man accustomed to directness in matters of cattle and land. But this was uncharted territory, and the words felt foreign on his tongue. She stopped when she saw him, her expression one of mild, polite surprise. The marigolds in her front yard seemed to burn with an even brighter color in the gray light. He took a breath, the air cool and tasting of wet earth. He tried for a smile, but it felt stiff, a poor imitation of the real thing. Be my sweetheart for a week. He grinned, not knowing she was his daughter's new teacher. June Hartley stared at him. The rain collected on the brim of his hat and dripped onto his shoulders. For a moment, she said nothing, her calm face a mask of incomprehension. Her eyes, the color of moss after a rain, searched his for some sign of jest, but found only a desperate sincerity. "You want to hire me," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "to be your companion for a week." The word hire made him flinch. It sounded so cold, so transactional, even though that was precisely what he was proposing. He rushed to explain, the words tumbling out in a low, earnest voice. "It is not for me. It is for my daughter, Rosie. Harvest Week is coming, and she is afraid to go without a mother." He saw a flicker of understanding, of sympathy, in her eyes and pressed on. It would not be a real courtship. There would be no pretense of romance between us. I just need someone to stand with us, to be there, so she does not feel alone. He spoke of the town events, the church service, the harvest supper. He just needed a woman's presence, a gentle hand to hold his daughters. He could see the refusal forming in her expression, the polite but firm dismissal of a respectable woman to a madman's request. So he played his final card, the one he knew might make her listen. I know of your trouble with Mr. Grayson, and I have heard your mother is unwell and needs medicine. I will pay you well. More than enough to clear that fabricated debt and see to your mother's needs for the entire winter. The mention of her mother struck home. A shadow passed over her features, a deep and private worry. She looked down at her basket, then back up at him. The proposition was scandalous. It was an invitation for gossip and censure, but the money he offered was a lifeline. It was the difference between her mother having the laudanum she needed for her pain or going without. It was the freedom from Mr. Grayson's constant, insinuating pressure. She stood there in the misting rain, weighing her reputation against her mother's comfort. Finally, she gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. For 1 week, she said, her voice quiet but firm, and only for the child. Relief washed over Wade so completely it almost buckled his knees. He arranged to bring her to the ranch that afternoon, for what he awkwardly termed a practice visit, so Rosie could become accustomed to her before the festival began. When her wagon pulled up to the ranch house a few hours later, the rain had stopped, and a weak afternoon sun was breaking through the clouds. Wade came out onto the porch to meet her. As he did, the front door flew open and Rosie, who had been watching from the window, came running out. She did not run to Wade. She ran straight past him, her little legs churning, and launched herself into June's arms, burying her face in her skirt. "Mama," she cried out, her voice muffled by the fabric. The world seemed to stop for a moment. Wade froze, his hand halfway to his hat. June looked down at the small blonde head pressed against her, then up at Wade, her eyes wide with a dawning realization that mirrored his own. Rosie lifted her head, her face bright with a child's uncomplicated joy. "It is my teacher," she announced to her father, as if revealing a wonderful secret. "My new teacher." The pieces clicked into place with a sickening thud. The new school teacher? He had heard the talk in town, but he had never made the connection. He always had one of the ranch hands, a trusted older man named Silas, drop Rosie off and pick her up from the small schoolhouse. He had never been to the door himself, had never laid eyes on the woman who was teaching his daughter her letters. And now he had hired her to pose as his sweetheart. The potential for ruin was immense. It was one thing to hire a stranger, a woman passing through. It was another thing entirely to involve the town's schoolteacher in such a scheme. The news, as he knew it would, traveled on the wind. Silas, coming up from the barn, saw the embrace. He saw the teacher arrive in her wagon and get greeted like family by the child. By evening, the story was likely halfway to the next county. The widower Colton has brought the new schoolteacher home with him. The whispers would start in the general store, pass over the pews in the church, and be debated over every supper table in Dusty Ridge. The town's curiosity and its deep-seated prejudice would ignite like dry tinder. Later that evening, after Rosie was asleep, they sat in the quiet of his parlor. The air was thick with unspoken questions. June broke the silence. She reached into her reticule and pulled out a folded, yellowed piece of newsprint. She unfolded it carefully and handed it to him. It was a clipping from a city paper, dated 2 years prior. The headline was stark, speaking of a local boy who had vanished without a trace. Her name was in the article, mentioned as the last person known to have seen him. "I was his tutor," she said softly, her gaze fixed on the fire in the hearth. "They questioned me for weeks. They searched my home. The boy's family was influential, and they needed someone to blame." She looked at him then, her eyes clear and direct. They found the boy. Weeks later, he had run away and fallen into an old well. It was a terrible accident. I was cleared of any wrongdoing. The law exonerated me. But people's words were not so easily retracted. The whispers followed me. It is why I left. It is why I came here, hoping for a place where I was not a story. Wade handed the clipping back to her, a new understanding of her quiet strength settling over him. He had seen her stand up to Grayson, but this was a different kind of fortitude altogether. He had brought this trouble, her past, back to her doorstep with his selfish plan. To break the heavy silence, she suggested they bake something for the first day of the festival. In the kitchen, the air soon filled with the warm, comforting scent of cinnamon and melting butter. June showed Rosie how to knead a small piece of dough, her hands guiding the child's. She called it a game, playing with the flour. But Wade recognized it for what it was. It was a kind of therapy, a way to soothe the child's anxious energy through the simple, tactile act of creation. Rosie, who was often so reserved, began to giggle as she covered her hands in flour. Laughter, real and unrestrained, echoed in the kitchen. Wade stood in the doorway, watching them. He had not heard that sound in this house for 3 long years. The lamplight cast a warm glow on the scene, on June's dark hair and the dusting of white on Rosie's nose. For the first time since his wife's passing, the house felt like a home. It was filled with a gentle warmth that had nothing to do with the fire in the stove. It was the warmth of life, of connection. When the cinnamon rolls were cooling on the counter, the 3 of them sat at the big wooden kitchen table, on a clean sheet of paper. They began to make a list of all the things they would do during Harvest Week: the pie baking contest, the hayride, the community bonfire, the Sunday service. As June wrote each item down in her neat, careful script, they spoke of it as a plan, a schedule to be kept. "It is just for 1 week," Wade said, as much to convince himself as her. "Just 1 week." She agreed, her eyes meeting his over the top of Rosie's head. But even as they said the words, they both felt the fragile falseness of the promise. They were drawing a map for a week of pretense, not knowing that their own hearts were already wandering off the path, heading into a wilderness far more complicated and beautiful than either of them could have imagined. The first day of Harvest Week dawned crisp and clear, the sky a vast, pale blue. The town square had been transformed. Bales of hay marked out walkways, and stalls overflowed with the bounty of the seasoned pyramids of apples. Heaps of pumpkins and squash, and jars of preserves that gleamed like jewels in the morning sun. The air was a rich tapestry of smells: roasting corn, sweet cider, and the earthy scent of hay. For the first time in a long time, Wade saw a spark of excitement in Rosie's eyes, a light that fear had not yet managed to extinguish. June held Rosie's hand, her touch both gentle and firm. They moved through the throng of townspeople. June, a calm island in a river of noise and motion. Wade walked slightly behind them, a silent guardian, watching his daughter. He saw how Rosie, who would normally have buried her face in his leg, instead looked to June for cues. When a horse snorted loudly nearby, Rosie flinched, but her eyes went straight to June's face. June gave her a small, reassuring smile, and the tension in Rosie's tiny shoulders eased. She was clinging to June not out of a desperate fear of the crowd, but out of a blossoming trust in her guide. It was a subtle but profound shift, and it did not escape Wade's notice. They stopped at a stall where children were making popcorn balls, their hands sticky with molasses. June rolled up her sleeves and helped Rosie pat the warm, gooey mixture into a lopsided sphere. Later, she sat with her on a hay bale, showing her how to use a small, dull knife to carve a cheerful, crooked smile into a small pumpkin. Rosie's tongue poked out from the corner of her mouth in concentration. When they finished, they ventured into the hay bale maze, inside the narrow, fragrant corridors. Rosie's initial hesitation melted into delight. Her small squeals of laughter as she ran ahead and then waited for June to find her were sounds Wade had not realized how much he had missed. He stood at the maze's entrance, a sentry at the gates of his daughter's happiness, feeling a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the autumn sun. As they emerged from the maze, blinking in the bright light, Pastor Mitchell approached them. He was a kind man with a weathered face and eyes that held a deep and abiding gentleness. He smiled, his gaze taking in the three of them, Wade standing tall and watchful, June with a smudge of pumpkin on her cheek, and Rosie holding her popcorn ball like a trophy. "The three of you," the pastor said, his voice warm with sincerity. "You look as though you were born to stand together." The simple, kindly meant observation landed with the weight of a stone. It was too close to the truth of what Wade desperately wished for, and too far from the reality of their arrangement. He saw a faint blush rise on June's cheeks, and he felt his own face stiffen. He managed a tight nod. "Thank you, Pastor. We are just enjoying the day." But the words felt hollow. The pastor's comment had given voice to the very illusion he was trying to create, making it feel dangerously, impossibly real. Their fragile peace was shattered later that afternoon. Wade was negotiating the sale of 10 head of cattle with a buyer from Cheyenne, the man appraising his stock with a practiced eye. Mr. Grayson chose that moment to approach, his smile as thin and insincere as ever. He tipped his hat to Wade, ignoring the other man entirely. A fine festival. Colton. A time for family. His eyes flickered over to where June was helping Rosie win a ribbon in a sack race. "A man in your position, a pillar of this community," he continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur, "must be mindful of the company he keeps. For the sake of the child, of course." Wade's blood ran cold. He turned slowly to face the store owner. "What are you saying?" "Grayson, just that talk travels. There are stories. A woman with a shadowed past. It would be a shame if such associations were to affect a man's business reputation. Perhaps a more favorable price on your grain this season would ensure such unfortunate stories remain just whispers." The threat was unmistakable. A vile poison coated in false concern. Grayson was using June's past, the rumors he had no doubt helped to spread, as leverage. He was putting a price on June's reputation and using Wade's love for his daughter as the fulcrum. A crowd had begun to gather, their conversations falling away as they sensed the brewing conflict. They were watching, waiting. Wade looked past Grayson to June, who was now standing still, her face pale. She had heard. He could see the familiar, haunted look in her eyes, the look of a woman who could never outrun the ghosts of other people's words. In that moment, something inside him solidified. He had created this situation. He had exposed her to this. He would not, could not, let her stand alone in the storm he had summoned. He turned his full attention back to Grayson, his voice low and steady, devoid of heat but carrying the hardness of winter ice. "My business arrangements are my own, Grayson, and my family is my own. You will not speak of Miss Hartley again." He let the words hang in the air, a clear and final warning. He then turned to the cattle buyer. "The price we discussed is firm." He did not wait for an answer. He walked directly to June and Rosie, turning his back on Grayson and the curious stares of the townsfolk. He had defended her, drawn a line in the dust of the town square for all to see, but as he looked at June's troubled face, he knew it was not enough. He had protected her name in public, but in the private court of his own heart, he remained silent, a coward terrified of feeling anything that might one day be taken away. That night, the ranch house was quiet. The day's excitement had exhausted Rosie, and she fell asleep almost as soon as her head hit the pillow. Wade sat by the fire, staring into the flames, while June tidied the kitchen. The pastor's words echoed in his mind, followed by the venom of Grayson's insinuation. He felt the familiar pull of grief, the deep, aching void his wife's death had left. For 3 years, he had built a fortress around his heart, stone by painful stone. Watching June with Rosie today, he had felt a crack appear in that fortress, a ray of warmth threatening to break through. The feeling terrified him. To love was to risk loss. He had lost once, and he did not believe he had the strength to survive it a second time. In the kitchen, June moved with a quiet, restless energy. She could still feel the sting of the crowd's eyes on her, could hear the echo of Grayson's veiled threats. Every kind word from the pastor, every laugh from Rosie, made the inevitable end of the week feel more like a betrayal. She was an actress playing a part, and she was doing it so well that the audience, and even the other actors, were beginning to believe it was real. But she knew the truth. She was being paid. That cold, hard fact tainted every warm moment. How could she look Rosie in the eye when the week was over? How could she explain that her presence, her affection, had a price? The thought was a constant, sharp pain beneath the surface of her calm exterior. As she lit the oil lamp on the kitchen table, its flame wavered in a draft from the window. It sputtered, shrank, then caught again, casting a small, steady circle of light in the growing dark. The little lamp seemed to her a reflection of their situation, a small, fragile light of hope and connection, surrounded by the vast darkness of rumor, fear, and unspoken truths. It was a light that could be extinguished by the slightest gust of wind. A few days later, a touch of humor broke through the tension. Wade, in a misguided attempt to contribute to the festival's bake sale, had tried to make a batch of molasses cakes. The smell of burning sugar soon filled the house. June rushed in to find him staring glumly at a tray of blackened, smoking discs. Rosie followed, her nose wrinkled. She surveyed the culinary disaster with the solemn gravity of a judge. She pointed a small, flour-dusted finger at her father. "Dad," she declared, "you burned the cakes. You are not allowed to touch the oven for the rest of the week." Wade looked from his daughter's serious face to June's, who was biting her lip to keep from smiling. He raised his hands in a gesture of surrender. He accepted his sentence without complaint, and for a few minutes, the sound of their shared laughter pushed the shadows back. The week culminated in the town's family prayer service, held in the square as dusk settled over the valley. Lanterns were lit, casting a warm, flickering glow on the assembled faces. Families stood together, their heads bowed. Pastor Mitchell stood on the steps of the general store, his voice rising above the murmur of the crowd, speaking of gratitude, of community, of the bonds that held them together. Wade stood with Rosie between him and June. He was intensely aware of the space that separated him from her, a gap of only a few inches that felt as wide as a canyon. He could feel the eyes of the town on them. He knew what they were thinking, what they were whispering. This was the moment of truth. He could stand here, a man beside a woman and a child, separate and undefined. Or he could close the gap. As the pastor asked them to join hands for the final prayer, Wade made a choice. It was not a choice born of logic or planning, but from a deeper, more urgent instinct. He reached out, his calloused hand finding June's. Her fingers were cool, and they tensed in surprise before relaxing into his grip. Then, he took Rosie's other hand. The three of them were now a closed circle, a physical manifestation of the pastor's words. Wade felt a powerful current pass between them, a shared vulnerability under the public gaze. He bowed his head, the words of the prayer a distant hum. All he could feel was the small, trusting hand of his daughter and the surprisingly strong grip of the woman beside him, a single, fragile seed of hope, planted not in secret but here, in the open, for the entire town to see, had just begun to break through the hard, dusty ground. The truce, born from a shared prayer in the town square, was a fragile thing, a thin sheet of ice over deep, churning water. For a few days, a comfortable rhythm established itself at the ranch. The evenings were the best. A fire crackled in the hearth, pushing back the encroaching chill of the autumn night. The smell of roasting meat or simmering stew filled the small house, a comforting aroma of domesticity that had been absent for years. Wade would sit in his worn leather chair, cleaning a piece of tack or reading the week-old newspaper, while June helped Rosie with a small slate, practicing the letters of her name. On the 6th night, the last night before the final day of the festival, the illusion was at its most potent. June had made a thick beef stew, and the three of them sat at the kitchen table, the lamp casting a warm, golden circle of light around them. Rosie was chattering happily, recounting a story about a squirrel she had seen that afternoon. Wade found himself smiling, a genuine, unforced expression. He watched the way June listened to Rosie, her head tilted, her eyes full of gentle attention. He looked at the scene, the lamplight, the steam rising from the bowls, the two fair heads bent close together, and for a dangerous moment, he let himself forget the arrangement. He let himself believe it was real. Rosie, full of stew and contentment, looked from June's face to her father's. She beamed, a milk mustache on her upper lip. "Will you stay forever, Mama?" she asked, her voice clear and bright in the quiet room. The question fell into the silence like a stone into a still pond. The air, a moment before so warm and full of life, instantly froze. Wade's spoon clattered against the side of his bowl. June's hand, which had been resting near Rosie's, drew back as if burned. The comfortable illusion shattered into 1,000 pieces. Rosie looked between them, her smile faltering as she sensed the sudden, inexplicable shift in the atmosphere. The word "Mama," which she had cried out in joy upon June's arrival, now hung in the air, an accusation and a heartbreaking plea all at once. Wade could not find his voice. He could only look at June, whose face had become a pale, unreadable mask. June was the first to move. She forced a small, tight smile for Rosie's benefit. "It is late, little one," she said, her voice strained. "Time for bed." The rest of the evening passed in a haze of strained politeness. After Rosie was asleep, Wade retreated to the barn, needing the familiar smells of hay and horse to clear his head. He was checking a latch on a stall door when June appeared in the wide opening, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the cold. She did not speak at first, just stood there, a silhouette against the star-dusted sky. When she finally spoke, her voice was low but held an edge of tempered steel. "She is not a role to be played. Wade, she is a little girl with a broken heart. What you have asked me to do, it is cruel. Not to me, to her." He kept his back to her, running his hand over the rough wood of the stall. He knew she was right. Every moment of laughter, every shared meal, was building a hope in his daughter that he was planning to demolish at the end of the week. "I did not know what else to do," he said, his own voice rough. June stepped further into the barn, the lantern light catching the earnest, troubled look on her face. "And what will you do now, when the week ends tomorrow, and I am gone? What will you tell her then? That the affection was for hire, that her new mother was just a stranger you paid to pretend?" The words were like blows, each one landing with painful accuracy. He turned to face her, his own turmoil etched onto his features. I do not know," he confessed, and the admission felt like a failure of his very soul. He was a man who always had a plan, a solution, but here, in this matter of the heart, he was lost. June looked at him for a long moment, a deep sadness in her eyes. "I cannot be a part of it anymore. Wade, for her sake, I will stay through the final service tomorrow, as we agreed. But then I must go. It is better to make a clean break now, before she is hurt any more deeply." Without another word, she turned and walked back toward the house, leaving him alone in the lantern light with the weight of his impossible bargain. He felt a profound and desolate emptiness open up inside him, a void that was not just about his daughter's sadness, but about his own. The next day, Grayson made his move. The store owner, having been publicly rebuffed by Wade, had spent the week poisoning the well of public opinion. He started a new, more malicious rumor, one that twisted Wade's defense of June into something sordid. He told folks that the new school teacher was not just a woman with a questionable past, but a cunning opportunist. He painted a picture of a woman using a lonely widower's grief and his vulnerable child to secure a permanent position and a comfortable life in Dusty Ridge. The story was as baseless as his faked ledgers, but it was far more dangerous. It preyed on the town's suspicion of outsiders and its rigid ideas about a woman's proper place. The rumor reached the ears of the school board. An emergency meeting was called. June was summoned to the small room behind the church to answer for her conduct. She faced 3 grim-faced men, pillars of the community, who looked at her as if she were a specimen under glass. They spoke of propriety, of the example a teacher must set. They questioned her association with Mr. Colton, implying a moral laxness that was unbecoming of her position. June listened to their accusations with her hands clasped in her lap. When they were finished, she did not offer a tearful defense or an angry denial. She spoke with the same quiet dignity she had shown in the face of Grayson's public pressure. "Gentlemen," she said, "my only concern has been for one of my students, a little girl who has suffered a great loss and who is struggling to find her footing in a world that is often loud and frightening. My actions, however they may appear to you, were taken with her well-being in mind. She did not ask for their pity or their pardon. She simply asked for their patience. Give me a little more time," she concluded, "for Rosie's sake." Her sincerity and her focus on the child, rather than on herself, seemed to disarm them. They conferred in low voices, then announced they would defer their decision. They would observe the situation, but the threat remained, a guillotine suspended over her career. Wade heard about the meeting later that day. A cold fury, unlike anything he had felt in years, settled in his gut. This was his fault. His desperate, ill-conceived plan had placed her career, her very livelihood, in jeopardy. That evening, after a tense and nearly silent supper, he walked the perimeter of his ranch. He stopped at a section of the wooden fence that bordered the road. It was weathered by years of sun and snow. The rails split in places. The posts, leaning. He had been meaning to fix it for months, but had never found the time. The fence seemed a perfect symbol of his own making. It was the boundary he had erected around his life, meant to keep the world out, to protect what was inside, but it was cracked and failing. It had not kept the pain out. It had only served to fence him in, to isolate him with his own grief and fear. He knew what he had to do. He had to tear the fence down, both the one made of wood and the one he had built around his heart. He had to end the pretense. For June's sake and for Rosie's, he would tell June she did not have to leave. He would face the town, the school board, Grayson, all of them. He would find the words to explain the truth, or at least a version of it they could accept. But when he returned to the house, a new and more terrible crisis was waiting. The next morning, as the first pale light of dawn crept over the mountains, he went to wake Rosie for the final day of the festival. Her bed was empty. Her small boots were gone, as was her favorite cloth doll. Panic, sharp and cold, seized him. He called her name, his voice echoing in the still house. June came running from her room, her face etched with alarm. On the small table beside Rosie's bed lay a piece of slate. On it, in the shaky, oversized letters of a child just learning to write, was an unfinished message. "I am going to find the happy smell plow." The words stopped there, a heartbreaking, incomplete thought. Wade stared at the slate, his blood running cold, the happy smell. He remembered her talking about the old rose garden behind the church, a place his wife used to take her, a place she said smelled like happiness. He looked at June, his face a mask of terror. The garden was overgrown, bordered by a steep, rocky creek. The child was gone, and it was all his fault. The word on the slate, incomplete as it was a key turning a lock in Wade's memory. The happy smell. His wife had called it that, the wild, overgrown rose garden behind the old, disused chapel on the hill. It was a place she had loved, a tangle of thorny vines that still produced a few stubborn, fragrant blooms each summer. a place of ghosts and memories, a place a small, lonely girl might go to find a piece of her mother. Panic, raw and absolute, tore through Wade. For a single, paralyzing moment, he could not breathe, could not think. The image of the steep, rocky creek bed that ran just beyond the garden filled his mind. Then the paralysis broke, shattered by a surge of pure adrenaline. He turned to June, his face a mask of primal fear. "The chapel," he said, his voice a hoarse rasp. "She is at the chapel." There was no time for questions. As Wade ran for the barn, his boots pounding on the hard-packed earth, June was already running toward the small corral where the house pony was kept. "Ride to town," he yelled over his shoulder, his hands clumsy and shaking as he threw the saddle on his own horse. "Get help! Get everyone!" The news of Rosie's disappearance swept through Dusty Ridge like a prairie fire. June rode the pony hard, her hair coming undone from its neat bun, her face set in a grim, determined mask. She did not have to shout the news. The sight of the schoolteacher, a woman known for her composure, riding hell for leather into the town square at dawn was alarm enough. Men stopped in their tracks. The blacksmith, his hammer raised mid-swing, let it fall with a clang. Women came to the doors of their homes, wiping their hands on their aprons. Within minutes, the entire town was stirring. Pastor Mitchell, alerted by the commotion, met June as she slid from the pony's back. He listened to her breathless explanation, his kind face becoming grave. He wasted no time. He rang the church bell, not the slow, steady peal for Sunday service, but a frantic, urgent clamor that spoke of emergency. A sound that brought every citizen into the street, the town, which had so recently been a hotbed of gossip and suspicion, transformed in an instant into a single, cohesive unit with one purpose: to find the child. Wade did not wait for them. He rode like a man possessed, his big horse eating up the miles to the chapel. The weather was turning. The wind, which had been a gentle breeze from the south, had swung around to the north, and it now blew with a sharp, cold edge. The sky was no longer a clear, pale blue, but a bruised, ominous gray. Red dust swirled in the air, stinging his eyes and tasting of grit and fear. He pushed the horse harder, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. When he reached the base of the hill where the chapel stood, he found them. Faint, heartbreakingly small footprints in the damp red earth, already being blurred by the relentless wind. He dismounted, leaving his horse to stand, its sides heaving. He followed the tracks on foot, his eyes scanning the ground, his world narrowed to these tiny, fragile signs of his daughter's passing. He was not the only one following that desperate trail. After raising the alarm, June had refused to stay behind, driven by a terror that was as fierce and primal as Wade's own. She had made her way to the chapel on foot, taking a shortcut across a shallow ravine. She arrived at the edge of the abandoned rose garden just moments before Wade, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her eyes scanning the tangled mess of thorns and dead leaves. The garden was a desolate place, a thicket of neglect. Gnarled, thorny canes, some as thick as a man's wrist, clawed at each other, creating a dense, impenetrable wall. It was a place where light struggled to enter. For a moment, she felt a wave of despair. How could anyone find a small child in such a place? Then she heard it, a small, weak sound, half whimper, half cry, almost lost in the rising moan of the wind. "Rosie!" June did not hesitate. She saw a small patch of blue fabric deep within the thorns. She plunged into the thicket, ignoring the sharp, tearing pain as the thorns ripped at her dress and scratched long, red lines on her arms and face. She did not feel it. Her entire being was focused on that small patch of blue. She fought her way through the grasping branches, her own blood beating on her skin, until she reached the center. Rosie was huddled at the base of a dead rose bush, her small body trembling with cold and fear. She was tangled in the vines, her face streaked with tears and dirt. When she saw June, she let out a cry of pure, desperate relief. June fell to her knees and gathered the child into her arms, holding her tight, shielding her with her own body. "It is all right," she whispered over and over, her own tears mingling with Rosie's. "I am here. It is all right." Wade broke through the edge of the trees a moment later. He saw them in the gloomy half-light of the thicket. He saw June, her dress torn, her face bleeding, holding his daughter in a fierce, protective embrace. The sight of them, the raw, visceral proof of this woman's love for his child, was the thing that finally broke him. The rigid control that had been his armor for 3 long years, the stoic discipline of the Western man, the silent grief of the widower, all of it crumbled into dust. A great shuddering sob escaped him, a sound torn from the deepest part of his soul. He stumbled forward and fell to his knees in the dirt beside them, the strength gone from his legs. The tears he had refused to shed for 3 years came now, a hot, unstoppable flood. He did not make a sound, but his whole body shook with the silent, racking grief of a man who had come too close to losing everything. Again, he reached out a trembling hand, his fingers brushing against Rosie's tangled hair. Then he looked at June, his eyes full of a raw, broken vulnerability she had never seen before. "I hired you for a week," he said, his voice thick and unrecognizable. The words were a confession, an apology, a declaration, all at once. "But my heart," he continued, his gaze locking with hers. It forgot this was a business arrangement. It forgot all about the payment. Rosie, safe and warm in the circle of their arms, hiccuped, her sobs subsiding. She looked up at her father's weeping face, a sight so new and strange it momentarily distracted her from her own fear. She processed the scene with the simple, unassailable logic of a 4-year-old. Her father was crying. He was sad. And he had done a bad thing before, burning the cakes. This was different. This was a time for forgiveness, for celebration. "Dad," she said, her small voice cutting through the heavy emotion. Her lower lip trembled. "You can touch the oven now. You have to bake a cake for my homecoming." The simple, profound absurdity of the command broke the spell. Wade let out a choked sound that was half sob, half laugh. June pulled Rosie even tighter, burying her face in the child's hair, her own shoulders shaking with a mixture of tears and relieved laughter. They huddled together like that for a long moment, a small, battered family forged in terror and found in a thicket of thorns. A fine, cold drizzle began to fall, pattering on the dead leaves around them, mixing with the red dust on their skin. It felt like a baptism, a washing away of the pretense and the pain. In the distance, the town's church bell began to ring a slow, steady rhythm, the signal that the search was over, that the lost was found. To Wade and June, holding each other in the abandoned garden, it sounded like forgiveness. As they finally stood, Wade lifting a shivering Rosie into his strong arms, the wind gusted again. It was a different wind now, no longer just cold, but sharp and brutal. It carried a scent that Wade knew all too well, the clean, sterile smell of deep snow. He looked to the north. The sky was no longer just gray. It was the color of lead, churning and heavy. The immediate crisis was over, but as the first hard, frozen pellets of sleet began to sting his face, he knew a far greater one was bearing down upon them all. An early blizzard was coming, and it was coming with a vengeance. The relief that settled over Dusty Ridge was as palpable as the biting wind that heralded the storm. The town, united in its fear for a lost child, had found her. And for a few hours, that was all that mattered. The whispers and suspicions were forgotten, replaced by a shared sense of community and the quiet gratitude of a prayer answered. But the reprieve was short-lived. The sky was a churning mass of leaden gray, and the wind had a wolf's howl. rattling window panes and stripping the last stubborn leaves from the cottonwood trees. Back at the ranch, a fragile peace reigned. June cleaned the long, angry scratches on her arms and face with a solution of witch hazel. Her movement steady despite the tremor she felt deep inside. Wade watched her, his heart a tight, painful knot in his chest. He had seen her plunge into that thicket of thorns without a moment's hesitation, had seen the fierce, maternal love in her eyes as she held his daughter. The debt he owed her was not one that could ever be repaid with money. It was a debt of the soul. Just before the first flakes of snow began to fall, a lone rider galloped into the ranch yard, his horse lathered and steaming. He was a boy from the next town over, and he carried a letter for June. He could not stay, he explained, shouting over the wind. He had to get back before the pass became impassable. June took the letter, her hands trembling slightly as she recognized her mother's frail, spidery handwriting on the envelope. She read it in the kitchen, the flickering lamplight casting shadows on her pale face. Wade saw her expression change, saw the worry deepen into a stark, hollowed-out fear. "She is worse," June said, her voice barely audible. "The doctor says the winter will be hard on her. He suggests I take her south, to a warmer climate, before the real cold sets in." The word struck Wade with the force of a physical blow. Take her south. Leave! Just when he had found her. Just when he had allowed himself to feel the first fragile stirrings of hope. She was going to be torn away. "No," he said, the word more a reflex than a thought. June looked up, her eyes full of a weary sadness. "Wade, I have to. She is my mother." "Let me help," he said, stepping closer. "We can send for the medicine she needs. I will pay for the best doctor to come from Cheyenne. Whatever it takes. Do not go. Stay here, with us." The plea hung in the air between them, raw and undisguised. June's gaze softened, but she shook her head slowly. She looked toward the small room where Rosie was sleeping, safe and warm. "I cannot be another burden to you." "Wade, I will not be." She folded the letter with a finality that broke his heart, the quiet decision of a woman who had learned long ago to rely only on herself. That night, as the snow began to fall in thick, silent curtains, a cold and resolute fury settled over Wade. He had almost lost his daughter to the wilderness. He would not lose June to the machinations of a petty, greedy man. The storm outside was a force of nature, unstoppable and impartial. But the storm of rumors and lies that Grayson had unleashed was a man-made thing, and what one man could make, another man could unmake. The next morning, with the snow already piling into deep drifts against the barn, Wade rode into the shuttered town. He went first to the small cottage of Thomas Miller, a young man who had worked as a clerk in Grayson's store until he had been abruptly dismissed 2 months earlier. Wade found the boy splitting firewood, his face grim. "Grayson said I was short on the till," Thomas told Wade, not meeting his eyes. "But I was not. I saw him. He keeps 2 ledgers, one for the taxman and the public, and another, older one, where he marks down the real debts, the ones he uses for leverage. He fired me because I saw it." "Did you ever see him write letters?" Wade asked, his voice low and even. "Anonymous letters." The boy's head shot up, his eyes wide with a flicker of recognition. He told Wade of evenings when Grayson would stay late, scribbling on cheap paper, his face pinched with a kind of spiteful glee. He had found a crumpled draft once in the trash, a vicious, unsigned screed full of lies about the blacksmith's wife. He had been too afraid to say anything. That was all Wade needed. He went next to the blacksmith, a man of few words and immense integrity. He told him what the boy had said. From there, they went to 2 other ranchers who had long suspected Grayson of cheating them on the price of grain. Armed with the testimony of the former clerk and the support of his neighbors, Wade had his ammunition. Justice on the frontier was not always found in a courtroom. Sometimes it was found in a church, in the court of public opinion. Pastor Mitchell had called a town meeting for that afternoon. The official purpose was to organize a plan for the blizzard, to check on the elderly and ensure everyone had enough fuel and food. But everyone knew it was more than that. The events of the past week, the rumors, the disappearance and recovery of the Colton girl, all of it had brought the town to a boiling point. The church was packed, the air thick with the smell of wet wool and simmering tension. Grayson stood near the pulpit, basking in the attention, positioning himself as the town's leader in the crisis. He spoke of prudence and community, his voice slick and self-important. Wade sat in a pew near the back with June, Rosie asleep on her lap. He waited. He listened as others spoke. Then, when a lull fell over the room, he stood up. Every head turned toward him. A hush fell over the congregation. Wade Colton was not a man for public speaking, and his rising commanded their full attention. He did not walk to the front. He stood where he was, his voice clear and steady, carrying to every corner of the room. "Before we talk about the storm outside," he began, "I need to talk about a storm that has been brewing right here in our town, a storm of lies." His eyes found Grayson and held him. The store owner's smile faltered. "There have been rumors about Miss June Hartley," Wade continued. "Rumors about her past and about her character. I am here to tell you that these rumors were started and spread by one man, for his own profit." He held up a sheaf of papers. He spoke of the 2 ledgers, of the fake debt assigned to June's father. He called on Thomas Miller, who stood nervously and confirmed every word. Wade then produced a letter, one Grayson had sent to the cattle buyer from Cheyenne, full of vicious innuendo about June. A letter intended to pressure Wade into a lower price. The handwriting was a match for the store's ledger. The proof was undeniable, laid bare for all to see. The murmurs in the church grew from a whisper to an angry buzz. But Wade was not finished. He looked not at Grayson, but at the faces of his neighbors. He looked at June, whose own face was a mixture of shock and dawning relief. "Justice," he said, his voice ringing with a quiet authority, "is not always about a loud shout or a fast gun. Sometimes it is just about a good person standing in the right place at the right time." He paused, then took June's hand, his thumb stroking the back of her knuckles. "This woman," he said, his voice softening but losing none of its power, "is the right place for me. June Hartley and my daughter, Rosie, are my family. Anyone who speaks a word against her will have to answer to me." The declaration was absolute. It was not a proposal or a hope. It was a statement of fact, as solid and unmovable as the mountains that surrounded them. The aftermath was swift and decisive. The town turned its back on Grayson. Faced with ruin and disgrace, he was forced by a council of the town's leading men to make full restitution to everyone he had cheated. He would leave Dusty Ridge as soon as the pass was clear. His store was turned over to Thomas Miller, its ownership a debt paid for a reputation destroyed. Later that evening, as the blizzard raged outside, turning the world into a howling vortex of white, Wade and June stood on the sheltered porch of the ranch house. In a small pot, protected from the worst of the wind, was a single, small rose bush Wade had ordered from a catalog weeks ago, a thing he had bought on a foolish, hopeful whim. It had arrived on the supply wagon just before the storm. Together, their hands touching in the cold air, they packed fresh soil around its base. It was a fragile thing, its roots not yet set, a tender shoot of life in the face of the storm's fury. It would need care and attention to survive the winter, just like the new, fragile family they were only just beginning to build. The storm had trapped them, sealed the valley off from the rest of the world. The conflict with society had ended, but a new one, a battle for survival against the raw power of nature, was just beginning. The blizzard did not arrive gently. It descended upon the valley with the full, shrieking fury of a predator. The world beyond the ranch house windows dissolved into a churning chaos of white. The wind was a physical force, a solid wall of sound and pressure that seemed intent on tearing the very shingles from the roof. Snow, driven horizontally, plastered itself against the north-facing walls and piled in deep. Sculpted drifts that swallowed fences and transformed the familiar landscape into a hostile, alien terrain. Inside the small house, the storm's roar was a constant, unnerving presence, but there was also warmth, the steady heat from the cast-iron stove, the golden glow of lamplight, and the smell of coffee brewing. Rosie, oblivious to the elemental war being waged outside, was asleep in her bed, exhausted by the emotional turmoil of the previous day. Just after midnight, Wade returned from a final check of the main barn. His eyebrows and the brim of his hat caked with ice, he stomped the snow from his boots, his face grim. "One of the new heifers," he said to June, his voice tight with worry. "She picked a bad time to have her first calf. She is in distress, and the little one is weak." Without a word, June began pulling on her own boots and the heavy wool coat Wade had given her. "You cannot go out there," he said, his hand moving to stop her. She met his gaze, her own calm and resolute. "You cannot do it alone. Wade, she belongs to this family now." Too, her use of the word family was quiet, deliberate, and it silenced any further protest. The journey from the house to the birthing barn, a distance of less than 100 yards, was a brutal, staggering battle. They leaned into the wind, heads down, following a rope Wade had strung earlier as a guide. The cold was a living thing, a malevolent presence that clawed at any exposed skin and stole the breath from their lungs. Inside the smaller barn, the air was thick with the smell of hay, manure, and the sharp, metallic scent of birth. The wind howled through the cracks in the walls, but a single lantern cast a pocket of warm, steady light. The young mother cow lay on her side, her breathing ragged, her eyes wide with pain and exhaustion. Beside her, a tiny, spindly-legged calf lay shivering in the straw, too weak to stand. For the next 2 hours, they worked together in a seamless, unspoken partnership. Wade, his hands gentle despite their size and strength, tended to the mother, speaking to her in a low, soothing murmur. June took charge of the calf. She rubbed it down vigorously with rough burlap sacks, stimulating its circulation, trying to bring life and warmth back into its trembling body. She managed to get a few drops of its mother's milk onto her fingers and coaxed it to suckle, a tiny, fragile victory against the storm's immense power. They were so engrossed in their work that they did not hear the frantic pounding on the main house door. It was Silas, the old ranch hand, who finally found them in the barn. "A wagon," he shouted over the wind, carrying a family on their way to Cheyenne, got stuck in a drift down by the main road. The man, his wife, and their 2 small boys. They will freeze to death out there. Wade's jaw tightened. "Get them to the house," he ordered Silas. "Get the stove roaring. June, you stay here with the calf. I will bring them in." But June was already on her feet. "No," she said, her voice firm. "I am going with you. You will need help with the children. The little one is standing now. She will be all right with her mother for a little while." The rescue was a nightmare of snow and wind. They found the wagon half buried, its occupants huddled together under a thin blanket, their face ablue with cold. Wade and June carried the 2 small boys, their bodies limp and frighteningly light, back through the blizzard, fighting for every step. By dawn, the Colton Ranch had become a sanctuary. The rescued family was bundled in blankets by the fire, sipping hot broth June had made. Silas had brought in 2 itinerant workers who had been caught in their thin tent on the edge of town. The ranch house, which had been a place of quiet grief for so long, was now filled with the murmur of voices, the cries of children, and the smell of stew simmering on the stove. It was crowded and chaotic, but it was alive. June moved through it all with a calm, efficient grace, a bedrock of compassion in the midst of the storm. She organized blankets, tended to the frostbitten fingers of the rescued father, and ensured everyone had something warm to eat. She and Wade were no longer just a man and a woman in a fragile arrangement. They were the center of this small, temporary community, partners in a battle for survival. That night, the second night of the storm, the wind finally began to lose some of its fury. Though the snow continued to fall in a thick, silent blanket, the house was quiet, its temporary occupants asleep in makeshift beds on the floor. Rosie was curled up on a pallet of blankets in the hayloft of the main barn, a place she had always found comforting, nestled deep in the sweet-smelling hay. Wade found June standing by the massive barn doors, peering through a crack at the endless white. He came and stood beside her, the silence between them comfortable, charged with the shared experiences of the last 48 hours. "I was going to leave," she said softly, her voice almost lost in the low whistle of the wind. "After the festival, the letter from my mother. I thought it was my only choice. I was afraid of being a burden, afraid of what would happen to Rosie, to all of us." When the pretense ended, Wade turned to her, the lantern light casting deep shadows on his face. He led her to the ladder of the hayloft. "Let us check on Rosie," he said. They climbed into the loft, the air warm and fragrant. Rosie was sound asleep, her small face peaceful, one hand clutching her cloth doll. They sat down in the hay, one on each side of the sleeping child, a silent pair of guardians. He finally spoke, his voice low and rough with an emotion he had suppressed for years. "I have been afraid every single day for 3 years. June, afraid of the silence in the house, afraid of forgetting the sound of my wife's laugh, afraid of failing Rosie." He reached out, his hand covering hers where it rested on a blanket near the child. "When you came here," he continued, "I was afraid of the warmth, afraid of the feeling of having a partner again. Most of all, I was terrified of what it would mean to lose it all a second time." He looked at her, his eyes shining in the dim light, stripped bare of all pretense. "I hired you to be my sweetheart for a week, but if that was an act, I am the worst actor in the whole of Wyoming." A slow smile touched June's lips, a smile of profound and gentle understanding. "Good," she whispered, her fingers lacing with his, "because I do not want to act anymore." He leaned across the small, sleeping form of his daughter. The space between them, which had once been a canyon of unspoken truths and painful secrets, was now just a few inches of warm, hay-scented air. He kissed her. It was not a kiss of fiery passion, but one of deep, quiet reverence. It was a kiss of gratitude, of homecoming. It was tender and warm, a silent promise made in the heart of the storm. It was the taste of a future he had not dared to dream of. When they parted, they simply looked at each other, their hands still clasped over the sleeping child. In that moment, June made her choice. Her mother's letter, the pull of the South, the fear of being a burden, it all fell away. This was her place. This was her fight. This was her family. She would not run from the storm, either the one outside or the ones that might come in the future. She would stay. The blizzard raged for another day and another night, but inside the Colton ranch, something had shifted. A quiet sense of hope had taken root, a stubborn warmth that the storm could not extinguish. They shared their food, their firewood, their strength. The crisis had stripped away all the petty grievances and social pretenses, leaving only the simple, profound truth of human beings taking care of one another. On the third morning, they awoke to silence. The wind had died. The world was still. Wade rose and opened the great barn doors. A brilliant, almost blinding light flooded the space. The storm had broken. The sky was a flawless, crystalline blue. The sun, rising over the eastern mountains, struck the endless expanse of fresh snow, making it glitter as if seeded with millions of diamonds. As the sunlight streamed into the barn, it caught the swirling dust motes, the tiny particles of hay and chaff, and transformed them into a shower of shimmering gold, a kind of ethereal, sunlit snow. It was the dawn after the long, dark night. It was a new beginning. The Sunday after the storm felt like the first day of a new world. The snow, already beginning to melt under a surprisingly warm sun, muffled all sound, draping the valley in a blanket of profound and holy silence. The air was so clean it was like breathing for the first time. As the people of Dusty Ridge made their way to the church, their boots crunching in the snow, there was a new feeling among them. The shared ordeal of the blizzard had scoured away the petty crust of gossip and suspicion, leaving behind the bedrock of community, the simple, unadorned truth that they needed one another to survive. Wade, June, and Rosie rode to the service together in the sleigh, its runners whispering over the packed snow. Rosie was nestled between them, a small, warm bundle wrapped in a thick wool blanket. There were no more questions in the eyes of their neighbors, only quiet nods of respect and gentle smiles. The town had seen Wade's declaration of family, not just in his words at the meeting, but in the way he and June had worked as one to rescue and shelter those in need. They had seen it in the fierce, protective love with which June had plunged into a thorn thicket to save a child. They had seen the truth, and it was a thing far more powerful than any lie Grayson could ever have concocted. The church was warm, the air smelling of damp wool and pine boughs from the leftover Harvest Week decorations. Pastor Mitchell's sermon was simple. He did not speak of fire and brimstone, but of the parable of the Good Samaritan. He spoke of how a crisis reveals the true character of a man and of a community. His eyes rested on Wade and June for a moment, a look of profound, paternal blessing in his gaze. After the final hymn, as the congregation began to disperse, Wade did not move from the pew. He waited until only a few families remained, talking in low, warm voices. Then he stood. He did not have to raise his voice. A quiet expectation fell over the room. He walked to the front of the church and stood before the simple wooden pulpit, not behind it, but in front of it, on the same level as his neighbors. June watched him, her heart beating a slow, steady rhythm in her chest. He stood there for a moment, his gaze sweeping over the familiar faces. These were the people he had known his entire life. He had celebrated their weddings, mourned their losses. They had seen him as a boy, as a husband, as a grieving widower, and as a father. They deserved the whole truth, or at least the part of it that mattered. "Many of you," he began, his voice clear and direct, a voice accustomed to calling cattle over a long distance, "have seen me struggle these past few years. You have watched me try to be both a father and a mother to my little girl, and you have been kind. But a man cannot be what he is not. A child needs a home, not just a house." He paused, his eyes finding June where she sat, holding Rosie's small hand in hers. "A few weeks ago, I made a desperate choice. I brought Miss Hartley to my ranch as part of a foolish arrangement, hoping to shield my daughter from a little pain. It was a plan born of fear. But life," he said, a small, wry smile touching his lips, "has a way of undoing a man's foolish plans. The storm we all just endured taught us a few things. It taught us who our neighbors are. It taught us what truly matters when the wind is howling." He took a deep breath, his gaze unwavering. "June Hartley is not a passing guest in my home, or in this town. She is home. She is my family. And that is the end of the story." It was a Westerner's speech, short, plain, and absolute. There was no room for argument or interpretation. It was a statement of fact, laid down like a cornerstone for a new life. A deep silence followed, and then, from the back of the church, the blacksmith began to clap, his big hands making a sound like hammers on leather. The applause spread, not loud or boisterous, but a warm, rolling wave of acceptance and support. Pastor Mitchell came forward and placed a hand on Wade's shoulder, his smile radiant. The whispers of Dusty Ridge were finally, truly, silent. In the days that followed, the resolutions fell into place with the quiet certainty of a spring thaw. Grayson, his reputation in tatters, loaded his belongings onto a wagon and left town under a gray, unforgiving sky, not even bothering to look back. The sign on the general store was taken down, and a new one was painted by the blacksmith's wife, its fresh black letters proclaiming Miller's Mercantile. Thomas Miller, his face a mixture of terror and pride, stood behind the counter, a living symbol of the town's quiet course correction. At the ranch, a new kind of life began to take root. The house, which had long echoed with silence and memory, was now filled with the sound of Rosie's laughter. One afternoon, June came into the parlor to find Rosie sitting on the floor, surrounded by her wooden alphabet blocks. The child was carefully, deliberately, arranging them in a line on the worn rug, F-A-M-I-L-Y. She looked up at June, her small face beaming with pride at her accomplishment. June knelt down, her vision blurring as tears filled her eyes. She was not crying from sadness. She was crying from a joy so profound it was almost painful. She pulled Rosie into a fierce hug, laughing through her tears, the sound of beautiful, new music in the old house. A week later, the last of the great snowdrifts had melted, leaving the valley floor damp and greening under the warm sun. The dormant grasses on the hillsides had been cured by the frost and sun into a pale, shimmering gold. Wade saddled 2 horses. "Let us ride," he said to June. Rosie, bundled in her coat, was placed securely in front of him on his saddle. They rode out into the vast open country, the air crisp and smelling of damp earth and pine. They did not talk much, content in the comfortable silence, the rhythmic creak of saddle leather and the soft thud of the horses' hooves the only sounds. A red-tailed hawk circled high above them, a dark speck against the brilliant blue sky, its piercing cry a song of freedom and wildness. They stopped on a low ridge that overlooked the entire valley. The town of Dusty Ridge, a collection of miniature buildings in the distance. The world spread out before them, peaceful and full of promise. Wade shifted in his saddle. Turning to face June, Rosie was watching the hawk, humming a little tune to herself. "June," he said, his voice quiet but full of a deep, resonant emotion. "A few weeks ago, I asked you for a week of your time. Now," he reached across the space between their horses, his hand covering hers on the pommel of her saddle. "I am asking you not for a week, but for a lifetime. Will you marry me? Will you be my wife and Rosie's mother for all the days we have?" June looked at him, her heart so full she could not speak. The entire, improbable journey of the last month flashed through her mind, the desperate bargain in the rain, the scent of cinnamon in the kitchen, the terror in the rose garden, the promise in the hayloft. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, but her lips were curved into a radiant, trembling smile. Before she could form a single word, a small, clear voice piped up from the front of Wade's saddle. Rosie, who had apparently been listening after all, twisted around to look at her father with an expression of fond exasperation. "Dad," she said, her voice full of 4-year-old certainty. "The answer is yes." Laughter, bright and free, erupted from both Wade and June, a sound that rolled out over the Golden Valley. Wade leaned over and kissed her, a real kiss this time, full of certainty and joy. They turned their horses for home, the 3 of them riding close together through the honey-colored light of the afternoon. The hawk circled one last time, then soared away toward the high peaks, leaving them to their new beginning. A family forged not by blood, but by a journey from pretense to promise. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We would love for you to comment and let us know where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. Please subscribe to my channel Wild West Night, like the video, and show your support by pressing the hype button so this story can reach more people.